The first time anyone saw her, she was running, barefoot, blood on her dress, hair tangled like prairie wire, her breath ragged from miles of fear. Most looked away. Some muttered about trouble. But not Jeremiah Boone. 72 years old, back bent from decades of cattle drives and fence posts, he didn't hesitate. He stepped between her and the men chasing her like it was still his land to defend, like it was still his job to stand in the way of cruelty. They didn't care about his age. They knocked him to the ground, boots flying, fists heavy. And the dust that rose that day tasted like blood and shame. The girl disappeared into the hills. The men rode off, laughing. Jeremiah was left in the dirt, ribs cracked, his jaw split, his shirt torn from the collar to the waist. The townsfolk found him hours later, sprawled beside the trough outside the general store. He didn't say much when they lifted him. Didn't name names. Just asked for water and said, "Did she get away?" That's what struck people most. Not the blood, not the bruises. The question. He cared more about the girl's escape than his own survival. The sheriff said it was too late to chase after them, that the girl was probably long gone, and the men who hurt Jeremiah weren't seen clear enough to identify. No one argued. No one helped. That kind of silence isn't unfamiliar in towns like these, where justice depends more on comfort than on courage. So Jeremiah returned to his ranch. He didn't ask for pity. He didn't hold bitterness. He just walked out of the place where they'd beaten him, and he started digging. Neighbors thought he'd gone mad. But every day, even with broken ribs and fingers that barely worked, he planted marigolds, bluebonnets, daisies, wildflowers that don't ask for much water, just sun and a bit of earth. By the time spring returned, the stretch of ground that once held his pain now held color. And when someone finally asked him why, he just said, "If something ugly happened there, I figure it deserves something beautiful too." What Jeremiah didn't know, or maybe he did, was that the girl had survived, that she'd watched from a ridge, trembling, as the old man was beaten in her place. And that weeks later, she'd come back, not to apologize, not to explain, but to kneel in the flowers and leave a note by a stone that read, "You didn't know me, but you saved me, and I won't forget." And from that moment on, the man the world thought was broken became a legend, not for what he lost, but for what he chose to grow. In the weeks following the attack, Jeremiah Boone went about his days like nothing had changed. He fed the horses. He walked the perimeter of his land each morning before the sun rose above the canyon. And when his hand stopped trembling long enough, he planted, not rows of crops, but pockets of wildflowers, carefully chosen, gently laid, one seed at a time. He didn't speak much to those who visited, and those who did come by never stayed long. They didn't know what to say to a man who had taken a beating not for a kin, but for a stranger. A girl with no name, no voice, and no place to go. Some in town said he was a fool, that he should have looked away like everyone else. "You're old, Boone," one man muttered outside the post office. "You've got no business picking other folks' fights." Jeremiah just stared at him, jaw still swollen, then tipped his hat and walked away. Because deep down, he knew the West was full of people who'd learned to survive by stepping back. But he'd lived long enough to know there's a world of difference between surviving and living. Every evening, he'd return to the patch of dirt near the general store, where the blood had once stained the ground. That's where he planted the marigolds, bright, defiant yellow, the kind of flower that grows even in dry places. And every time he bent down to press his palm to the earth, he remembered her, the way her eyes darted back as she ran, full of terror and gratitude. He didn't need to know her name. He already knew her story. He'd seen that same fear in his wife's eyes once, decades earlier, the day she'd returned from a neighboring town with bruises no lawman dared report. As winter faded and the first buds broke through the dirt, something began to shift. People noticed. The dirt patch where violence had been born now bloomed in soft color. Children started walking that path on their way to school, touching the petals like they were sacred. And Jeremiah, once just an old man at the edge of town, became something more, a reminder that even in a world hardened by cruelty, beauty could still rise from the places where we fall. He didn't say it out loud, but each flower was a message. To the town, to the girl, maybe even to himself. A message that pain, when met with intention, didn't have to grow into bitterness. It could bloom into something that reminded others not to turn away, not to forget. And as the flowers multiplied, so did the weight of what had been done, not in guilt, but in memory. The note arrived quietly, folded into a sliver of parchment, and tucked between the roots of the biggest marigold. Jeremiah found it at dawn, just as the mist was lifting off the road. It was written in careful, trembling script. I saw what they did. I saw what you did. I'm still alive because of you. There was no name, no plea, just that, and a single press petal, pale pink, tucked inside. He held it for a long time, then folded it back and placed it in his pocket like it belonged next to his pulse. From that morning on, he worked with new purpose. The flowers spread beyond the dirt patch. He began planting along the road, lining the fence posts, filling in the hollow spots between stone and brush. And every day, someone new would pass by, sometimes stopping to help, sometimes only watching in silence. A few left wildflower seeds. A few brought water. A child even left a tiny wooden cross. The town, once quiet in complicity, began to stir. One evening, the mayor stopped by, not with a speech, but with a shovel. He stood beside Jeremiah, awkward at first, then started digging. "We failed her," he said after a long silence. "We failed you." Jeremiah didn't respond. He didn't need to. The sound of shovels and soil said more than words ever could. For the first time in years, that town began to heal. Not with laws, not with talk, but with action grounded in humility. A new rumor spread, that the girl had been seen again, far beyond the hills, working at a small mission near the river. That she spoke little, but always carried a flower tucked into her braid. Jeremiah never confirmed it, never chased after her. That wasn't the point. She had gotten away. That had been the only thing that mattered. And now, she was planting her own kind of life, rooted in the courage of a moment that nearly ended in silence. By summer's end, the stretch of land where pain had once ruled was covered in bloom. The wind carried the scent of flowers instead of dust. Travelers slowed their horses just to look. And for those who asked what happened there, the townsfolk didn't tell the story in full. They just said, a girl was saved, and an old man planted something, so we'd remember why. And in that remembrance, the West, hardened as it was, found something soft and something sacred. By the time the church bell rang for autumn harvest, something had shifted permanently in the town's rhythm. People spoke softer when they passed the flower beds. The blacksmith, who once boomed with laughter at rough jokes and rumors, now sat quietly on his porch each evening, whittling crosses from mesquite wood and laying them by the blooms. There was a kind of reverence in the air, like even the horses stepped lighter when trotting past the spot where Jeremiah had been beaten. Pain had made the soil sacred, and sacred places, in the West, were few and fiercely protected. One afternoon, two boys from a neighboring town rode in. They were rough, young, and loud, the kind who had never been taught where decency begins or where violence ends. They mocked the flowers, kicked at the fence. One of them spat and laughed, asking who the old fool was that thought flowers made a man. The town held its breath as Jeremiah stepped forward, slower now, limping from more than age. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked the boy in the eye and said, "One day, you'll have someone to protect. When that day comes, I hope no one stands still." The words hit like thunder in the stillness. The boys left without another word. And that night, the townspeople gathered, not for vengeance, but for reflection. They lit candles along the flower beds. One by one, without planning, without speeches, they stood in silence beside Jeremiah. Not because they agreed with every choice he made, but because they now understood why he made them. In the West, a man's actions are his legacy, and Jeremiah Boone had chosen beauty over bitterness, love over fear. The sheriff, who once brushed off the attack, came forward too. With trembling hands, he placed his badge on the old wooden gate of Boone's property. "This badge means nothing if I wear it for comfort," he said. "You reminded us what it should stand for." Jeremiah, never one for ceremony, nodded once. Then he returned to his porch, where he carved into the armrest of his rocking chair. She lived. That was all he ever needed to know. That was all the town needed to remember. As autumn gave way to the cold whispers of winter, the flowers didn't vanish. They bent, they closed, but they clung to life. Like Jeremiah, like the town. And every frost that kissed the petals only made their bloom and spring more powerful. Because now, the land had memory. And memory, in the Old West, was the only justice time could not erase. In the coldest days of winter, when the frost clung to every rail and the wind howled like a restless ghost, Jeremiah fell ill. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden collapse, no tragedy. Just a quiet weakening, like a candle burning lower each day. Still, each morning, wrapped in his wool coat and worn boots, he walked to the flower bed. The marigolds had withered, but their stalks stood like soldiers, defiant and proud. He'd touch each one gently, whispering something no one else could hear. Neighbors started taking shifts bringing him food. The doctor visited often. The preacher offered prayer. But Jeremiah, as always, asked for none of it. His eyes still searched the horizon every evening, as if looking for something, or someone. Then, one morning, just after a light snow dusted the town, a rider appeared. A woman, hair braided tight, eyes sharp but tired, a single flower tucked behind her ear. She dismounted without a word and walked to Jeremiah's porch. She stood before him, not as a girl anymore, but as someone carved by time and healing. She didn't cry. Neither did he. She simply placed a small pouch on the table. Inside it, more seeds. Native flowers, rare and wild, ones that only grew in the deep valleys of her people. Then she knelt, as she had done that night so long ago, and whispered, "I came back because I couldn't let the flowers forget." And Jeremiah, his voice rasped by age, replied, "Then they never will." That afternoon, side by side, they planted. No crowds, no ceremony. Just two souls bound by a moment that changed them both. The town watched from a distance, understanding that this was not just reunion, it was rebirth. Something sacred had returned, and the land, quiet beneath the winter's weight, seemed to exhale with relief. By nightfall, a light snow began to fall. The girl, now a woman, stayed one more day before riding west. She left no address. Jeremiah never asked. That's not how things worked in the West. You meet, you change each other, and sometimes you part. But her presence lingered like the scent of rain on dry ground. And the flowers, those new seeds, waited patiently beneath the frost, ready for spring, ready for the next story to take root. Spring arrived slower that year, but it brought with it a kind of quiet promise the town hadn't felt in decades. Shoots of green pierced the thawing earth near the old flower beds, delicate yet stubborn, much like the girl had been when she first appeared at Jeremiah's fence. Only now, the flowers were different, taller, wilder, colors no one in town had ever seen bloomed under the same sky that once watched violence unfold. Folks said it was like the land itself remembered, and was choosing to celebrate survival over silence. Children began to play again near the fields. Parents who once warned their little ones to stay away from Boone's side of the road now walked them straight to the flowers, telling stories they'd once been too afraid to share. The spot had become more than a garden. It had become a testament, a living symbol of what it meant to choose courage, to bleed for a stranger, and to leave behind beauty instead of bitterness. And right in the middle of it all stood Jeremiah, older than ever but still standing. One morning, a teacher from two towns over-visited with a group of schoolchildren. They sat cross-legged in the dirt as Jeremiah told them the story, not of his injuries, nor of the hatred that came with that day, but of the girl, of the note she left, and of how a single act of compassion could ripple through generations. One boy asked if he ever regretted it. Jeremiah just smiled, his eyes glinting like morning dew on wild petals. "Not once," he said. "You regret silence. You regret fear, but you never regret doing what's right." That day, the children each planted one seed. A new ring of flowers took root around the original patch. The town began calling it Hope's Circle. Nobody carved a plaque or built a fence. That wasn't Jeremiah's way. The story didn't need to be locked in stone. It lived better in memory, in soil, in breath passed from one storyteller to the next. That's how truth survives in the West. Not through headlines or monuments, but through the whispered retelling of those who felt it happen. And the girl, the woman, though never seen again, became part of that legend. Some said they spotted her in distant valleys, speaking to children in native tongue, always with a flower behind her ear. Others claimed she'd started a healing camp near the river bend, teaching others to turn wounds into gardens. Jeremiah never confirmed nor denied any of it. He simply kept tending his flowers, knowing that the real blossoms weren't in the soil. They were blooming in every person who carried the story forward. Years passed, and the ranch changed hands. Jeremiah had no heirs, but he left behind something richer than inheritance. The land was placed in trust, and the townspeople, once passive observers, became guardians of the space. They took turns planting, pruning, sharing the story with travelers who passed through on horseback or in motor cars. What was once an act of defiance had transformed into a heritage. And in the West, heritage is sacred. One stormy night, lightning split the sky and fire tore through the northern fields. Panic swept the town as wind pushed the blaze toward Boone's land. But something miraculous happened. When the flames reached the flower beds, they slowed. Not a spiritual miracle, perhaps, but one born from years of care. The soil was damp, rich, tended. The fire curled back like it had met resistance, not just from water, but from memory. And when morning came, not a single bloom had burned. The next day, the sheriff, a different man now, younger, with Jeremiah's same quiet resolve, led a group to replant the scorched edge of town. They didn't just restore what was lost. They expanded. Boone's line, they called it, a boundary of blossoms marking where hurt had been stopped, where kindness had held its ground. Mothers brought newborns to see it. Fathers stood in silence. Old cowboys touched their hats and walked away with misted eyes. Because they knew, real strength isn't about how loud you roar. It's about what you protect when no one else will. The girl's story, her face, her name, had long since blurred into myth. But her spirit remained in every act of compassion that followed. In every child who chose kindness over cruelty. In every stranger welcomed into the town without question. And especially in every seed dropped into that earth, with hope blooming just beneath the surface. Her memory lived not in grief, but in growth. And growth, in the West, was the rarest form of resistance. And as for Jeremiah Boone, the last anyone saw of him was the day before the storm. He'd been kneeling by the flower bed, planting something new, seeds no one recognized, quiet as always. When they asked what it was, he just said, something wild, something strong, something that remembers. And then he smiled, stood, and walked back toward the porch, as the wind carried the scent of old blossoms toward tomorrow. The ranch stood quiet for a while after Jeremiah's passing, but the silence wasn't empty. It was sacred. People came not to mourn, but to listen. To feel the wind that once wrapped around a man who planted flowers where pain had been sown. They didn't replace his rocking chair. They left it just as it was, creaking in the breeze like an old friend refusing to say goodbye. And at sunrise, a curious thing happened. Petals began sprouting from the steps, as if the earth itself had decided to keep the ritual going. One day, a young widow named Eleanor arrived from the Southern Trail. She carried 2 children and a past too heavy for words. The townspeople watched as she knelt near the flowers, touched the soil, and closed her eyes. No one spoke. No one needed to. Later, when she stood before the town council, she didn't ask for food, or land, or help. She asked for permission to keep the garden growing. And not a single man or woman said no. Under Eleanor's care, the flower beds became wilder, fuller. She didn't just plant for beauty. She planted for the forgotten. Each color meant something. Blue for children who lost their parents. Yellow for the wounded who never healed. Red for the ones who stood up and paid a price. And white. White was for the ones who never made it home, but somehow left their mark anyway. Locals began calling it the living prayer, because walking through it felt like stepping inside a memory too big to hold in words. More travelers came. Some left behind boots caked in sorrow. Others brought seeds from distant places. A preacher once cried as he buried his last sermon notes beneath a row of daisies, whispering, "This will preach longer than I ever could." There are no altars, no pews. But the people called it a chapel, just the same. Not made of stone, but of silence and wind and things that grow after fire. And everyone who stepped onto that land left something behind and carried something with them. Jeremiah's legacy was no longer just a man or even a place. It had become a language of colors, of soil, of stories whispered to the petals. It was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever been beaten for doing right, and everyone brave enough to rise anyway. In a world that once rewarded power with fear, this ranch stood as proof that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is plant a flower where you bled. Seasons rolled by like clouds over prairie hills, and time did what it always does. It softened the sharpest edges. But the garden? It remained sharp in memory, precise in feeling. Young people, born long after Jeremiah's final planting, still knew how to tell the story. Not word for word, but heart for heart. They'd walk the edge of Boone's line and say, right there's where they struck him, and right here, he forgave them. And they'd point to a patch of orange tulips, stubborn and proud. A schoolteacher named May, who'd once been a student during Jeremiah's last storytelling circle, took it upon herself to preserve the lessons of the land. She organized a yearly flowering day, where families gathered not just to plant, but to confess. One man admitted he'd once turned his back on a boy being bullied. Another spoke of a sister he hadn't seen since a cruel word tore them apart. As they planted, they healed, one root at a time. Then, something unexpected happened. On the 25th flowering day, a woman arrived. She wore a long woven shawl, and though older, her eyes carried the same fire as the girl Jeremiah had once shielded. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't need to. She walked the garden slowly, her fingers brushing each flower like she was reading their names in Braille. When she reached the center, she placed down a single item, a small carved figure of a man holding a flower. She didn't speak much, just said, he was more than a man. He was a soil turner of the soul. Then she walked to the porch where his chair still creaked, sat for a long time, and before leaving, whispered something no one heard. But when she left, the garden seemed to glow. It was as if all the stories had finally returned home, like migrating birds finding the place they were born. That night, the stars over Boone's ranch burned brighter than anyone could remember. Elders said it was Jeremiah tipping his hat one last time. Children didn't go to bed on time. They laid in the grass and looked up, whispering promises into the sky. And the wind, ever gentle, carried them across the fields, through the flowers, and into tomorrow. Because that's what stories in the West do. They don't end. They plant. They bloom. They wait. Years later, the world beyond Boone's ranch grew louder, faster. Railroads hissed across once silent plains. Telegraph wires buzzed where birds used to nest. People built bigger, talked quicker, forgot easier. But somehow, amid all that noise, the garden still stood. It was never advertised, never mapped. And yet, people found it, not with their eyes, but with their wounds. Because pain has a strange way of guiding the lost to the places that still remember how to listen. One such traveler was a young drifter named Eli, who arrived with a limp and a scar running across his temple like a crooked river. He didn't speak for 2 days, just sat near the daisies, touching the soil as if waiting for something to rise up from it. On the 3rd day, May sat beside him and said, he didn't speak either, you know, not at first, not until someone cried beside him. Eli didn't answer, but that night, he left a loaf of bread on the garden's edge, still warm. And in the morning, a note beside it read, for the next hungry soul. Eli stayed. He built benches, repaired the porch, helped replant during storms. But more than that, he listened. To the petals, to the soil, to the echoes that still whispered when the wind got low. He never asked for a title, but folks began calling him the caretaker. And perhaps the most poetic part of it all, he never once claimed to know Jeremiah. But everything about the way he moved said otherwise. Sometimes legacy is not taught, it's caught. The town around the ranch changed. New families arrived, old ones left. But every child, regardless of name or origin, learned to walk the path where the flowers bloomed brightest. That path, never paved, never marked, was the same one Jeremiah once limped home on, beaten but unbent. And now, it was a sacred trail walked barefoot by children whose hearts hadn't yet hardened, because the soil had memory, and it gave that memory freely to the innocent. And so it was that Jeremiah Boone's story lived on, not in books, not in sermons, but in quiet gestures and blooms that refused to die. He had been a rancher, yes, but more than that, he had been a gardener of hope. A bruised man who chose beauty. A forgotten soul who chose to remember others. And now, even as the world galloped forward, he remained, not in body, but in bloom. On the 50th anniversary of the first flowering day, the sky opened, not in sorrow, but in gift. Rain fell gentle, steady, as if even heaven wanted to anoint the soil. People came from towns no one could pronounce, from cities that had long since paved their flowers. They came with children, with parents, with pain. Each held a single bloom in their hand, and when they reached the center, they knelt, just as Jeremiah once had, when he'd tended the garden after the beating. A preacher spoke, not long, not loud, just enough to remind the gathered souls that love doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through hydrangeas. Sometimes it hides in lilacs. And sometimes it bleeds into the earth and returns decades later in the hands of a stranger. No names were shouted. No medals were given. Just a silence, deep and holy, that wrapped itself around every living thing present. Children scattered seeds into the wind, laughing as the rain kissed their cheeks. Elders stood with hands over hearts, not in nationalism, but in remembrance. And May, now gray and bent like an old willow, read aloud from a weathered journal. It held Jeremiah's words, simple, scratched, eternal. They hurt me, one line read, but I refused to let pain grow roots. So I planted love instead. That line echoed long after the ceremony ended. People whispered it on trains, on dusty roads, in quiet homes where hurt still lingered. It became more than a quote. It became a compass, a way to walk. And even those who had never set foot on Boone's land began tending their own gardens, not of vegetables or profit, but of mercy. Mercy for the broken, for the bruised, for the ones who, like Jeremiah, chose not to fight back, but to bloom. And that, perhaps, is the truest miracle of the West. Not in gunfire or gold, but in the stubborn, wild hope of a man who was beaten and planted flowers where he was hurt. Sometimes, the most powerful revolutions begin in silence, not with fists or fire, but with a wounded man kneeling in the dirt, choosing to sow kindness where pain once struck. Jeremiah Boone never built an empire. He didn't leave behind riches, titles, or territory. But what he did leave behind was far greater, a legacy rooted in compassion, grown from bruises and watered by grace. In the harsh, unforgiving lands of the Old West, he proved that mercy could still take root, even where the soil had once tasted blood. Throughout this story, we've walked the dusty trail of a man who was hated for an act of humanity, a man who was beaten for saving a girl and chose to respond not with vengeance, but with flowers. That decision echoes louder than any gunshot ever could. It changed not only his life, but the lives of all who came after him. He taught his town, and now us, that wounds don't have to become weapons. They can become gardens. The girl he saved grew into a woman of strength and grace. The orphan brother learned to speak, not with fear, but with wonder. And the land that had once been a place of silence and shadows became a sanctuary where people came to heal. All because one man decided to bloom instead of break. That's not just history. That's a blueprint for living. And maybe that's what we're being asked now. To carry this story beyond the screen. To plant flowers in the cracks of our own world. Not just literal ones, but acts of patience, of kindness, of forgiveness. You never know who's watching. Who's learning from your choice to respond with love, where it would be easier to strike back. Because somewhere out there, another Jeremiah is kneeling in the dirt, trying to decide what to do with the pain in his hands. If this story moved you, if it stirred something silent inside you, take a moment to breathe it in, then breathe it out into the world. Subscribe to this channel if you believe in stories that heal. Like this video if you believe kindness still matters. And leave a comment telling us, what flower would you plant where you were once hurt? Let's fill this space and this world with blooming hearts.